The strange world of Roman moral laws. Rome periodically experienced waves of moral panic. Every few decades, some stern senator would stand up, declare the empire in moral ruin, and demand stricter laws against excess. One notable example was the Lex Appia, passed during the Punic Wars. It restricted women from owning too much gold or wearing fancy clothing. The logic was that luxury had to be limited because the state required sacrifice. Women were extremely unimpressed. After the war ended, senators debated repealing the law. Women flooded the streets, lobbying aggressively. They cornered senators, blocked traffic, and demanded fashion freedom. Eventually, they won. No empire comes between aristocratic women and their jewelry without consequences. Let's drift toward the forbidden now. When we talk about forbidden pleasures, we don't just mean food, wine, and reclining furniture. Some Roman elites were fond of more adventurous gatherings, private parties hosted behind guarded doors. The guest list included poets, actors, dancers, and people whose job titles were never officially defined. Roman literature hints at these events carefully. Writers used delicate metaphors, flowery phrases, and the occasional thinly veiled complaint. One poet, clearly irritated he wasn't invited, wrote several verses implying that certain private dinners dissolved into activities that made even Bacchus raise an eyebrow. Rumors spread easily among aristocrats. Senators pretended to be outraged in public and deeply curious in private. The delicate case of Emperor Nero and, of course, there's Nero. He fancied himself a musician, singer, and actor. Unfortunately, no one dared tell him he wasn't very good. Imagine attending a mandatory concert performed by your boss, who expects thunderous applause. The tension must have been delightful. Nero hosted elaborate performances where aristocrats were required to praise his talent. He also enjoyed private artistic gatherings that occasionally spiraled into revelry. Suetonius described these events in dramatic detail, which means at least half of it might be exaggerated. But still, where there's smoke, there's usually someone trying to fan it with a theatrical prop. Nero also commissioned giant public feasts. Thousands attended. Food piled high on silver trays. Musicians, dancers, fountains of wine. The kind of event that would send an accountant into cardiac arrest to Nero. Luxury was performance art. Private clubs for public figures. Some wealthy Romans formed secret dining clubs. Groups of 9 or 12, meeting weekly, rotating villas, each host attempting to outdo the last. Menus included flamingo, tunga, delicacy, which understandably sparked ethical debates. Though flamingos were probably thrilled when the empire collapsed. These clubs were political too. Deals were whispered over honeyed wine. Alliances formed quietly. A senator might wake up the next morning, stare into his breakfast porridge, and realize he agreed to support legislation he barely remembered. Pleasure and politics walked hand in hand. Sometimes staggering, the curious case of luxury imports. Rome loved foreign luxuries. Silk from China, pepper from India, pearls from the Persian Gulf, ostrich meat from North Africa, ivory carvings, tiger skins. The Senate, outraged at the drain on Roman gold, repeatedly attempted to ban luxury imports. They lectured citizens about the dangers of foreign decadence, then quietly acquired silk robes for themselves. The contradiction was so blatant that Pliny the Elder complained silk made women scandalously visible, which tells you more about Pliny's anxieties than silk. Foreign merchants, meanwhile, smiled politely and continued shipping crates of sparkly things, forbidden books, and spicy poems. Rome had a complicated relationship with literature. They adored poetry, but sometimes poets pushed boundaries. Erotic poems circulated quietly among aristocratic circles. When the Emperor Augustus tried enforcing moral reforms, he exiled the poet Ovid for writing something deemed too suggestive. Ovid responded by spending his exile complaining poetically. His work remains popular. Augustus remains mildly mocked. Words, it seems, were as forbidden as anything else. The strange reality of Roman privacy for all their indulgence. Romans lived in crowded conditions. In the city, walls were thin, neighbors loud, and privacy scarce. Most apartments lacked kitchens, so people bought food from street vendors. Daily life was public, which made private pleasure seem all the more appealing. If you were wealthy, you were treated behind high walls, into courtyards, scented with roses and heavily guarded against nosy neighbors. Pleasure thrived behind doors. Tiberius, moral whiplash, before he retired to Capri. Emperor Tiberius attempted to enforce strict morality laws. He banned lavish banquets, restricted jewelry, and heavily regulated theater performers. Then, years later, rumors claimed Capri was a fever dream of indulgence. The contradiction was impressive. It may have been exaggerated. It might have been real. But either way, when an emperor says, "I need a vacation," historians take note, drifting to a soft conclusion. So here we are. Rome adored luxury, feared it, tried to ban it, then embraced it again. Aristocrats hid behind virtue while quietly enjoying silk pillows and suspiciously expensive perfumes. Emperors scolded citizens, then built marble pleasure palaces. It was a society playing tug-of-war between farm-boy simplicity and glittering indulgence. And, naturally, indulgence usually won as you let your eyelids grow heavy. Imagine faint music drifting through a Roman courtyard, warm lamplight flickering against stone, the soft murmur of conversation, the trickle of a fountain. Pleasure was never simple, but it was always near. Let's drift to the next royal fiasco. When you're ready, asterisk. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a place where marble shone under torchlight, senators squabbled over nonsense, and the wine was almost guaranteed to give you a headache by sunrise. If you haven't already, go ahead and dim the lights. Let the room settle. Get comfortable. Maybe loosen your shoulders. Imagine the slow hum of nighttime traffic outside, or a gentle breeze across a warm summer courtyard. Whatever relaxes you, because tonight we're sliding into ancient Rome, where respectable aristocrats loudly insisted they were paragons of virtue, while quietly arranging all sorts of interesting extracurricular activities. Rome was a masterclass in public modesty and private indulgence, the kind of society where someone could spend the afternoon lecturing about morals, and the evening participating in something their ancestors would have frowned upon so hard they'd sprain a brow. And yes, naturally, the Romans made it worse every century or so. Let's ease into things slowly. Rome's complicated relationship with pleasure. The Romans liked to pretend they were descendants of stern, mud-splattered farmers, people of rustic values, hard work, simple meals, good posture. But by the time we reached the late Republic and early Empire, that wholesome farm fantasy had evaporated into an endless stream of banquets, entertainment, gossip, and a generous helping of moral panic. Every generation complained that the next was lazier, softer, more spoiled, which, frankly, is a timeless tradition. If a Roman senator time-traveled to today, he'd probably take one look at a recliner and faint on the spot. One of Rome's favorite pastimes was publicly prohibiting something delightful, and then privately doing it anyway. Laws were passed restricting how much you could spend on dinner parties, limits on exotic ingredients, restrictions on jewels and fashion, which of course meant wealthy Romans immediately started inventing workarounds, like claiming that an outrageously luxurious dinner was actually a religious festival, or that their pearls were somehow therapeutic. Pearls are good for anxiety, surely. It's medicine, really. The lure of the banquet couch picture, a Roman banquet. In your mind, maybe you see a large dining table, chairs, silverware, white plates. No, Rome would like a word. Romans reclined on couches, because standing upright or sitting like a normal person was apparently too exhausting after a long day of pretending not to be corrupt. They lounged on cushioned couches called triclinia, sprinkled around low tables. You sprawled on your left side, propped up on an elbow, and delicately used your right hand to eat bite-sized morsels. The result was a room full of aristocrats lying sideways, occasionally making eye contact, while chewing like sleepy lizards, and reclining wasn't just comfortable, was exclusive. Freeborn Roman men could recline. Respectable women, mostly not. Slaves and poor guests. They stood and served. It was a very clear visual hierarchy. If you were horizontal, you mattered. Naturally, this led to complaints that society was becoming too horizontal. Seneca, moral philosopher extraordinaire, spent enormous amounts of time complaining about indulgence while living comfortably enough to own multiple vacation villas. He would have been a fantastic modern food blogger. Let's drift toward the baths. Few places reveal Roman pleasure culture better than their bath complexes, not a simple tub in a quiet room. No, we're talking massive complexes of hot pools, cold pools, steam rooms, tanning courtyards, massage halls, exercise yards, snack vendors, libraries, and importantly, gossip opportunities. Baths were less about hygiene and more about socializing. You might bump into a senator, your cousin, your sworn enemy, and a philosopher who insists he lives simply while wearing a very fancy cloak. Baths were cheap enough that ordinary Romans could visit frequently, which understandably horrified moralistic elites, because enjoyment was supposed to be stressful and exclusive. And then there were the massage. Oils were applied generously and rubbed vigorously. Muscles were kneaded by professionals whose job description hovered somewhere between spa attendant and amateur chiropractor. Sometimes, the massage oils contained exotic ingredients, myrrh, saffron, and occasionally things that sound suspiciously like today's overpriced skin serums. People floated through the baths in a haze of warmth, perfume, and low-murmured conversations, slipping easily into a kind of collective relaxation. It was one of the more pleasant aspects of Roman life. The empire wasn't always great at tranquility, but sometimes it managed. Forbidden. When technically legal Rome had an impressive ability to create moral crises out of things they enthusiastically enjoyed, authorities frequently issued bans on public displays of luxury. But these were enforced lightly, inconsistently, and mostly when someone wanted to embarrass a political rival. For example, there were rules about how many guests you could invite to dinner, because someone once threw a banquet so extravagant that an entire political faction complained. They said it encouraged moral decay. The host said it encouraged digestion. There were laws restricting purple dye in clothing, because purple signaled wealth and status. So when purple was restricted, wealthy people simply declared slightly different shades as completely unrelated colors. This isn't purple, officer. It's civil, twilight, lavender. The Roman Senate might disagree, but fashion usually wins. Emperors and their delicate weaknesses. Whenever we talk about Roman pleasures, we must, sadly, confront the emperors. Many of them were reasonable administrators. Others were walking cautionary tales wrapped in silk and questionable decisions. Take Tiberius. After years ruling Rome, he retreated to Capri Island, essentially saying, "I'm tired of the Senate. Please leave me alone." Capri, with its dramatic cliffs and secluded villas, had excellent privacy. Rumors swirled about what happened. There's some exaggerated, others suspiciously specific. Roman historians, always a subtle bunch, wrote about Capri like a gossip columnist describing celebrity beach parties. They hinted at indulgence, questionable entertainment, and a troubling number of musicians. Exactly how exaggerated these reports were depends on which historian you ask. Suetonius, for example, loved scandal the way cats love cardboard boxes. Helpful, but not always accurate. Then, of course, there's Caligula. If you know anything about Rome's questionable reputation, you probably know his name. He's often painted as a man who took pleasure to creative extremes. He supposedly declared war on the sea at one point. That's a unique hobby. Caligula enjoyed elaborate parties, enormous banquets, and watching senators squirm. He loved reminding them that their power depended entirely on him. It was the imperial equivalent of dangling a toy just out of reach. Whether every story about him is true is debatable. Romans adored exaggerating tyrants after they were safely deceased. You can be sure the Senate suddenly recalled dozens of things they witnessed. The delicate art of Roman wine was intense, often too sweet, too strong, or too suspiciously flavored. They frequently mixed it with seawater, resin, spices, and occasionally substances that probably should have remained outside the beverage category entirely. Drinking wine straight, without dilution, was considered barbaric. It was something foreigners did. Romans preferred their wine mild, conversational, and hydrating. Mixed with water, sipped while lounging, surrounded by incense, smoke, and gossip. And yes, the aristocracy imported expensive vintages. They boasted about age, origin, and clarity. They swirled their cups thoughtfully and nodded with fake wisdom, much like today's wine enthusiasts, except they had better sandals, of course. Wealthy dinner hosts sometimes labeled cheap wine as prestige vintage, a trick as old as social networking. The games, bread, circuses, and maybe more bread public entertainment was another outlet for Roman pleasure. Chariot races, gladiator fights, exotic animal hunts. The Romans adored spectacle. A day at the arena wasn't just about violence. It was about snacks, socializing, and performing outrage at your rival's favorite chariot team. People wore team colors. They cheered at high volume. They booed dramatically. It was basically a sporting event with slightly more lions. Officials noticed that when citizens were well fed and well entertained, they tended to complain less about boring politics and rising taxes. Bread and circuses became shorthand for distraction. Modern politicians likely took notes. Asterisk. Now, To maintain such a sprawling garden in the desert, you need water. A heroic amount of water. Legend tells us Nebuchadnezzar built intricate irrigation systems, perhaps involving Archimedean screws. Of course, Archimedes would be born 200 years later, so that historical detail is slightly inconvenient. But ancient writers weren't bothered by chronological accuracy. They wrote with emotion, not footnotes. More realistically, Babylon did have extremely advanced hydraulic engineering. They lifted river water using chains of buckets and channels. They understood the principle of the king wants water here, so we should put it here. The hanging gardens supposedly rose several stories high, supported by vaulted brick foundations stuffed with soil thick enough to hold roots. The columns had to be sturdy enough to prevent collapse under moisture, because water and mud are heavy, and Babylonian engineers, gifted as they were, could probably feel the stress in their bones as they drew plans. Imagine standing before these terraces in ancient times. The city around you is loud, dusty, almost too warm. Then, as you approach the gardens, the air cools. Shadows gather beneath trees. Leaves rustle softly, as if the city's noise has been muffled by nature's palms. It must have been impressive. Of course, some historians note quietly, politely, that there are no Babylonian tablets describing these gardens. There's no inscription praising them. Nebuchadnezzar wrote about other buildings, many. He bragged about temples in excruciating detail. He dedicated monuments. He carved his name into bricks, but not the hanging gardens. It's odd. Like someone posting photos of every meal on social media, except the Michelin star dinner. Greek writers, such as Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, described the gardens centuries later. Their accounts are similar, lush, vivid, almost suspiciously poetic, which leads to a second theory. Maybe the Greeks confused Babylon with Nineveh, an older Assyrian city further north. Archaeologists have found traces of extensive palace gardens there, including irrigation channels. And one Assyrian king, Sennacherib, proudly described his gardens in clay inscriptions. He even invented machines for watering them, but the hanging gardens of Nineveh doesn't roll off the tongue quite as elegantly. Babylon had better marketing. Still, people prefer the Babylon version. It has romance. A king building paradise for his queen. Even though many ancient marriages were political, not emotional. Middle Eastern kings did not typically stroll through botanical terraces holding hands, whispering poetry. But it's nice to imagine. Let's drift gently toward Nebuchadnezzar himself. His reign was long and stable, an ancient rarity. He conquered Jerusalem, built monumental walls, and generally took himself very seriously. He also occasionally went through bouts of moodiness, according to later biblical interpretations. At one point, some stories claim he wandered the wilderness behaving like an animal. Scholars suspect exaggeration, but it adds flavor to the emotional palate. He lived in a palace decorated with blue glazed bricks, gold ornaments, and reliefs of lions, the Babylonian symbol of power. Unfortunately for Nebuchadnezzar, lions are notoriously bad gardeners. The main gate of Babylon, the Ishtar Gate, shimmered with glossy cobalt tiles. Visitors passed through massive walls that seemed to stretch endlessly. Beyond, the city opened like a vast clay labyrinth. If the hanging gardens truly rose within these walls, ancient travelers would have seen greenery climbing skyward, a rare sight in Mesopotamia's flat plain. Priests served daily rituals in nearby temples. The air smelled of incense. Merchants bartered loudly, and somewhere above, a queen might have sat beneath shade, listening to trickling water, while priests and gardeners tried desperately to keep everything alive. Imagine the poor gardeners. Ancient texts rarely mention them, but someone had to climb these terraces daily, trimming, watering, fighting pests, negotiating leaf psychology. Maintaining a multi-level garden in a dry climate is hard work. And if a tree died, the king might notice. Nobody wants their monarch asking why his beloved orchard looks a little droopy today. Now let's drift through a quick, soothing glance at Babylon itself at its height. Babylon was one of the largest cities in the world. Massive defensive walls encircled it, apparently wide enough for chariots to race atop, though ancient writers tended to exaggerate. They described walls so thick that banquets could be held on them. Charming, but unlikely. Inside, streets wound toward temples and markets. Clay tablets rested in shelves. Scribes pressed red styluses into wet clay, recording everything from taxes to mythological stories. Babylon's bureaucracy was deep and detailed, the sort of administration that could assign you a fine for misreporting your goat's milk yield, religion-saturated life. The Babylonians worshipped Marduk, their chief deity, and built towering ziggurats in his honor. These stepped pyramids dominated the skyline, casting shadows over neighborhoods. Residents probably felt spiritually supervised. The hanging gardens, if they existed, would have enhanced this architectural drama, a symbol of human control over nature. A statement: we can bend trees to our will. Also, we can irrigate it. Altitude. Let's float gently to another aspect of this. Legend, prestige, Babylon needed to impress. Visitors, diplomats, envoys, rivals. If you could walk foreign dignitaries through a multi-tiered paradise garden, you sent a subtle message: we are rich, we are clever, we have water to spare. In ancient politics, that's devastating. And so, even if the gardens were exaggerated, the concept served propaganda well. Distant cultures repeated the tales. The Greeks added embellishments. Roman authors layered on dramatic description. Poets swooned. By the time medieval scholars copied these stories, the gardens had become mythic, like a mirage that everyone claims to have seen. Today, archaeologists excavating Babylon find remnants of canals, brick vaulting, and irrigation channels, but nothing conclusively proving a giant terraced wonder. Just enough evidence to keep the debate pleasantly unresolved, which is soothing in its own way. A few scholars propose that the gardens were destroyed by earthquakes. Mesopotamia is seismically active. Terraced structures are vulnerable. A gentle tremor might crack irrigation systems. Plants wither quickly without water, and centuries of dust erase traces. Or perhaps the gardens never existed physically, and lived only in the minds of ancient writers. Sometimes humans imagine paradise when reality disappoints them. Ancient cities were crowded, loud, and often unsanitary. The hanging gardens may have offered psychological escape. Even kings need escapism now. Let's gently drift into a smaller, often overlooked detail: water labor. If the gardens existed, water had to be lifted daily from the Euphrates River, likely by teams of workers. Bronze buckets, rope pulleys, sweat, sore backs. Someone, somewhere, cursed quietly as they hauled buckets up endless stairs. Gardening at altitude is glamorous in theory. In practice, you spend a lot of time elbow-deep in mud. Engineers, computed angles. Architects worried about root damage. Priests added ritual blessings, because when something breaks, it's always spiritually convenient to blame invisible forces rather than your irrigation math. Imagine the long, narrow walkways between terraces, sunlight filtering through leaves, birdsong, and below, the dusty, heat-hazed city, guards leaning on spears, scribes arguing about clay tablet formatting. Up in the gardens, perhaps, the queen found peace. Or maybe she politely smiled at her husband, thinking, "It's lovely, but a mountain would have been easier." History rarely records honesty. As the centuries passed, Babylon declined. Persian armies conquered the region. Alexander the Great visited and admired its grandeur. He intended to renovate it, including, according to some, the gardens. But he died before plans unfolded, and Babylon slowly faded into ruin. Sand and silence settled, where palace walls once stood. Greek writers preserved the legend. Roman authors repeated it. Medieval scholars copied it into manuscripts. Each generation tinted the story slightly differently, like watercolor bleeding across parchment. Modern visitors to the archaeological site see mounds of brick, dusty plains, and reconstructed walls. Hardly lush, hardly green, and yet we still imagine leaves rustling overhead, which reveals something gentle about human memory. Sometimes we prefer beauty that might not have existed. The hanging gardens persist not because we've excavated them, but because we hoped they were real. They symbolize longing, a queen missing her mountains, a king building love through architecture, engineers defying nature, and the belief that paradise can bloom in desert heat, even if it's only myth. Take one more slow breath. Allow the image of terraced greenery to settle behind your eyelids. Shade, waterfall, murmur, cool stone beneath your palm, and when you're ready, we'll drift toward another curious wonder of royal ambition, where mistakes bloom just as easily as gardens. Asterisk. Sometimes, and this is historically delightful, the lines for confession grew longer than the lines for the brothel, not because people were saintly, but because they went to both places. Human nature is consistent. Priests attempted reforms. They tried segregating brothel tents away from sleeping quarters. They imposed curfews. They threatened excommunication. Sometimes they even expel women from camps entirely. Soldiers protested. Commanders noticed morale dropping, and the women quietly returned. Eventually, some military leaders simply regulated the brothels. Rules included price limits, hygiene standards, and even hours of operation. It was administration by exhaustion. Meanwhile, confession remained compulsory. As crusaders marched deeper into foreign lands, their sins, real or perceived, grew heavier. They confessed to theft, desertion, anger, doubt, lust, and occasionally to questioning the quality of their rations, which felt sinful when your cook held a ladle like a weapon. The emotional anxiety was intense. Priests preached that dying unconfessed could lead to eternal suffering. That alone could send a crusader sprinting to the priestly tent now. Let's drift toward a famous example. During the siege of Acre in the late 12th century, crusader morale was draining like water through a sieve. Disease spread, food ran short, and fears of sin spiked. Priests organized mass confessions. Dozens of soldiers lined up, murmuring apologies for everything from impure thoughts to uncharitable comments about the commander's haircut. Afterwards, some soldiers walked directly to the brothel tents. Spiritual cleansing followed immediately by spiritual dirtying. The cycle continued. Some chroniclers noted this with stern disappointment. Others recorded it with resigned amusement. A few hinted that priests themselves occasionally visited brothels, though more discreetly, citing pastoral research. As confession culture grew, manuals expanded. By the 13th century, priests studied large handbooks that categorized sins by severity, intent, and circumstance. Tables suggested appropriate punishments. Penances could be mathematically calculated. This led to a rather bureaucratic view of the soul, like accounting. Except eternal, but the human heart is stubborn. Spiritual accounting rarely changes behavior for long. Let's take a slow breath and drift into one more layer, the theology of indulgences. As crusading progressed, the Church began offering indulgent spiritual pardons for those who engaged in holy warfare. This encouraged recruitment. You visit the Holy Land, we reduce your spiritual debt. It was effective. However, soldiers sometimes misinterpreted indulgences as permission for temporary sin, as if divine forgiveness extended on a credit line. Priests shook their heads, then sighed, then added new pages to the manuals by the late Crusades. Confession culture created anxious soldiers who desperately sought absolution before battle. Sin weighed heavily when you expected arrows to rain down at dawn. Confessors became essential to morale. They soothed fears, assigned prayers, and reminded soldiers that death would lead to paradise, assuming they had properly confessed their earthly errors. Meanwhile, brothels remained discreetly. At the edge of camp, some commanders finally threw up their hands and accepted the contradiction. They reasoned that frustrated soldiers caused discipline problems. Brothels, ironically, reduced violence in camp. Better regulated sin than chaotic sin, and so the Church and the army formed an unspoken agreement. Priests would continue preaching chastity. Soldiers would nod. Everyone would pretend not to see the line of men quietly disappearing into tent flaps after sunset. Confession would continue the next morning, long and weary. Now, let's gently float into the social consequences. Women who worked in Crusader brothels held a strange position. Some were local Middle Eastern women caught in the shifting tides of conquest. Others were European camp followers, traveling for stability or survival. They endured dangers. Armies are unsafe places. Violence, disease, and exploitation lurked nearby, and yet they also shaped Crusader culture more than many chroniclers admitted. They provided comfort. They calmed tempers. They prevented unrest. Priests occasionally tried to convert them. Some succeeded. Confession expanded again. Medieval chroniclers often glossed over brothels, embarrassed by their presence. But archaeological evidence and financial records tell the truth. Brothels followed the Crusades because Crusaders demanded them, and confession followed closely behind because Crusaders feared eternal punishment more than temporary embarrassment. This duality, sin and absolution, is what makes Crusader culture quietly fascinating from a distance. A slow, rolling contradiction, wrapped in chainmail. Let's drift to one final image for tonight's section. Picture a Crusader camp on the eve of battle. Torches flicker. The scent of smoke, sweat, and distant sea air mix into something familiar. Priests chant prayers, pacing among tents. Soldiers kneel, whispering confessions, some with trembling voices, nearby. Women sit quietly behind canvas walls, listening to the night. Later, soldiers who already confessed slip away, shadows blending with shadows. Human desire and divine expectation swirl together in the dark, forming something complex, contradictory, deeply medieval, and priests weary prepare again for dawn's confessions, because the cycle never ended now. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders soften. We'll drift, soon, to another royal oddity from another century, where humor, genetics, and questionable decisions continue gently, as always. Whenever you're ready, just whisper, "Hey everyone." Tonight we're drifting back to a world of warm desert winds, towering ziggurats, and a city so famous that poets couldn't stop writing about it, even when they'd never actually seen it. So, if you haven't already, go ahead and dim the lights. Find a comfortable position. Let your eyelids grow just a little heavier. We're visiting the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the ancient world's most mysterious landscaping project. Now, before we get lost in greenery, it's important to gently acknowledge something. We are not entirely sure the Hanging Gardens even existed. Historians have argued about this for centuries. Some believe they were real. Others insist they were ancient propaganda. Essentially the world's earliest tourism brochure. And a few suspect they were confused with another garden somewhere else entirely, which feels soothingly chaotic, but will drift through the legend anyway. Hold it softly. Don't grip too tightly. Like a plant you overwater because the pot looks thirsty. Babylon, long ago, sat in Mesopotamia, the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was a city of baked brick, bustling trade, religious ceremony, and bureaucratic scribes with clay tablets. Everyone felt very important, especially the kings, who truly believed the gods watched everything they did, including the quality of their gardens. The most famous king associated with the Hanging Gardens was Nebuchadnezzar II. He reigned in the 6th century BCE, and he did what many powerful monarchs tend to do. He built large things: temples, fortifications, towering gates. When you're wealthy and you want to be remembered, you pour money into construction, preferably construction that blocks sunlight for your neighbors. Nebuchadnezzar also had a queen, according to later tales, named Amytis. She supposedly came from a region with lush, rolling mountains, perhaps Media, near ancient Iran. Babylon, however, was famously flat, very flat, the sort of geography where you can see your enemies approaching from a day away, or where the wind gathers sand and delivers it politely into your eyeballs. Amytis, the legends say, missed her homeland. She longed for hills, greenery, flowing water, and the whisper of leaves. Nature, her new surroundings, were full of dust, noise, and bricks. Many bricks. Babylon loved bricks more than a modern hipster loves artisanal coffee. Seeing his queen homesick, Nebuchadnezzar decided to build her something comforting. A palace garden, but not a simple patch of greenery. No, he supposedly created tiers of planted terraces that rose high above the city walls. From a distance, they looked suspended in the air, hence hanging. These terraces were said to overflow with exotic trees, fragrant bushes, and vines that cascaded downward like ornamental waterfalls. Streams of water trickled through each layer. Birds nested among branches. The air was cool and shaded, a fragrant oasis above the heat, at least. That's how Greek historians described it. None of them actually saw it in person, but they were very confident. Asterisk. Her son, Caesarion, was executed by Octavian, because Rome enjoyed efficiency. With Cleopatra gone, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province, its independence evaporating as softly as incense smoke. And through all of this alliances, sibling marriages, political romance, naval disasters, Cleopatra remains frozen in history as the seductive queen with eyeliner that apparently conquered men's strategic judgment. But the truth is gentler. She was intelligent, multilingual, politically savvy, and capable of ruling a kingdom amid chaos. She inherited a mess and held it together longer than anyone expected. Her dynasty, however, was doomed from the start. Centuries of sibling marriage had created a family tree shaped suspiciously like a broom handle. Their political instincts, on average, rated somewhere between panicked goose and flute hobbyist. Cleopatra was the final spark in a lineage that had long burned itself out. Let's take a soft breath and drift onward soon. Two more royals whose family trees could politely be described as a mistake. Whenever you're ready. Asterisk, hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back across the centuries. So, if you haven't already, go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable. Take a slow breath. We're traveling to the age of crusaders, priests, dusty roads, and surprisingly organized brothels. Because of course, medieval Europe found a way to be morally anxious and morally contradictory at the same time. Let's begin gently. The Crusades were a series of military campaigns, launched by Christian Europe, aimed at capturing the Holy Land. They began in the late 11th century and rolled on intermittently for centuries. Like a particularly stubborn headache, kings, knights, peasants, and assorted volunteers marched east under the assumption that God wanted them to. Some genuinely believed it. Others were looking for land, wealth, or simply a break from the local political drama. And some went because everyone else was going. Peer pressure is timeless now. Crusaders are often depicted as armored, pious warriors, bravely fighting for divine glory. But when you gather thousands of young, poorly supervised men and put them far away from home, on long journeys, through hot climates, you discover that religious war attracts certain urges that priests would prefer you to ignore. Urges that commanders would prefer you to ignore, unless morale is low, which it often was, and that's where medieval brothel culture begins creeping into the story, quietly, steadily, like a cat that absolutely knows it is not allowed on the kitchen counter. Let's drift back a bit, though, to the general atmosphere of medieval morality. Europe during crusading times was deeply religious, in a nervous, anxious sort of way. God was everywhere. So was sin, and priests had developed an entire system of confession, penance, and spiritual accounting. Every action, big or small, was believed to leave a mark on your soul. People worried constantly. Had they confessed properly? Had they forgotten a sin? Was God watching? To be fair, God was always watching. Even when things got awkward, confession culture grew steadily throughout the Middle Ages. Priests encouraged people to confess regularly, once a year at least, but preferably more. The Church created extensive manuals listing sins with suggested punishments. Lying, for example, might require a short period of fasting. More serious sins required more serious penance. And some sins required penance so lengthy you'd die of exhaustion before finishing. Which was one way to clear the backlog by the time crusaders assembled for their holy missions. Confession culture had become deeply rooted. Before departure, priests insisted that every crusader cleanse their soul. Confession was mandatory. If you died on the battlefield, you wanted to be spiritually tidy. It was like spring cleaning, but louder, and with swords. But here's the gentle irony. While priests urged purity, crusaders lived in very human bodies. Bodies are curious things. They generate hunger, thirst, anger, and many other impulses. So when thousands of soldiers traveled together for months or years, the church faced a dilemma. Complete abstinence was the ideal. The tricky part was convincing anyone to follow it. Leading up to the First Crusade, church leaders tried dramatic speeches. They encouraged chastity, modesty, and self-discipline. They warned of the spiritual dangers of lust. They preached the beauty of celibacy, but the crusaders simply nodded politely, and then did what crusaders do. Let's drift into the gritty. Reality. Medieval armies were not composed solely of noble knights. They included squires, servants, cooks, blacksmiths, merchants, gamblers, opportunists, and people who had absolutely no idea where they were going. By the Third Crusade, commanders accepted that their armies needed morale stabilizers. It is difficult to keep soldiers calm when they're marching across deserts while losing battles, supplies, and hope. And so, brothels followed armies. Sometimes officially, sometimes not. Brothels called public houses of women existed in European cities long before Crusades. They were sometimes operated by local governments or licensed by bishops, who would then of course tax them. Because nothing says holy order like a convenient revenue stream. When Crusader armies moved, brothels moved too. Merchants saw opportunity, and medieval soldiers rarely turned down immediate opportunity. In some crusades, commanders tried to ban camp followers women who traveled with the army providing various services. This ban lasted approximately 30 seconds. The moment generals looked the other way, the camp thickened with unofficial companions. The church responded with predictable exasperation. Priests scolded. They lectured. They warned of demonic consequences. Yet many crusaders, after battling all day and reflecting on mortality, sought comfort. Not spiritual comfort. A different kind. The contradiction grew so obvious that bishops developed improvised solutions. Sometimes soldiers were told they could visit brothels, but only if they confessed afterward. It became a cycle, a strange loop of sin, confession, absolution, repeat. Some priests argued that confession was meaningless without regret, which led to philosophical debates about whether temporary regret counted. If you regret something now, but might do it again later, is the soul still cleaned? Medieval theology was complex. Let's drift further into confession. Culture itself. Confession manuals listed every sin imaginable. A priest, armed with one of these thick handbooks, could scan through pages of organized wrongdoing. They described scenes involving anger, gossip, gambling, gluttony, dancing too enthusiastically, telling jokes at inappropriate volume, and some proper thoughts about the wrong people. You might think that confessing was straightforward. You'd be wrong. Confessors were expected to examine not only actions, but intentions. Imagine a tired crusader explaining to a priest that he had visited a brothel because morale was low and the desert was hot. The priest would lean forward, eyebrows raised, and ask uncomfortable clarifying questions. Some scenes required public penance. Others required strict fasting. and some required pilgrimages. On occasion, confessors assigned penance that was simply impossible given the Crusaders' location and schedule, which meant, yes, uncompleted penances accumulated like unpaid bills. Now, you may notice a gentle contradiction. Crusaders were promised spiritual reward for fighting in the Holy Land. Pope Urban II declared that joining the First Crusade granted remittance of sins. It was a kind of spiritual coupon. Crusaders believed that killing enemies of the Church might wash away their own sins, which made some ask awkward questions about brothel visits. Could crusading righteousness offset bodily weaknesses? Priests sighed. Let's step into one of the Crusader encampments. Imagine rows of tents. The air is filled with smoke from cooking fires. Soldiers sharpen blades. Horses stamp. Nervous recruits practice with spears, worrying about tomorrow's battle nearby. A tent decorated with cloth markers operates as a makeshift brothel. Inside, women, some volunteers, some coerced on coin. Crusaders slip in and out quietly. Just beyond that, another tent stands. A confession tent. A priest sits inside, robe wrinkled, waiting for the next apologetic soldier. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to Egypt. You can settle in. Let your eyes relax. Maybe pull your blanket up a little higher. We're going to spend some time with Cleopatra, yes, that Cleopatra and her rather exhausting but entertaining royal family. It's a tale of sibling marriages, power, squabbles, political romance, and extremely questionable decisions, all told softly, gently, and just a touch sarcastically, because of course, nothing says sweet dreams quite like the personal drama of ancient monarchs. So, let's settle in. Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra people usually mean, was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty. This was a ruling family of Greek origin. They were descendants of Ptolemy I, a general under Alexander the Great who, after Alexander's death, took Egypt for himself. This meant that Cleopatra's family had been sitting on Egypt's throne for nearly 3 centuries, long enough to forget that they were technically foreigners, and long enough to develop the charming royal tradition of marrying each other. Because of course they did. The Ptolemies were enthusiastic about sibling marriage. They adored keeping the bloodline pure, which, in practice, meant turning it into something resembling genetic soup. When everyone in your family marries their cousin, or their sister, or their niece, you eventually get some eyebrow-raising symptoms, personality quirks, odd health problems. Occasionally, you get a Cleopatra. To be fair, Cleopatra herself was intelligent and healthy. In fact, she was startlingly competent compared to the rest of her relatives, who were usually too busy attempting to assassinate one another to notice Egypt burning down around them. She was multilingual. Reports claim she spoke 9 languages. She could converse with priests, generals, merchants, even foreign ambassadors in their own tongue. Quite impressive, especially in a family where most members struggled to speak coherently in one language. Sometimes, due to a charming genetic underbite, Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII, a somewhat pathetic king often described as weak, indecisive, and constantly broke. His nickname in Alexandria was Alliets, which meant the flute player. Not intimidating. He spent much of his time playing the flute, poorly, while bribing Roman politicians to keep his throne, a hobby that is surprisingly expensive. Not surprisingly, the Egyptians were not thrilled with him. They disliked that he acted more like a Roman puppet than a pharaoh. They disliked that he taxed them heavily to pay off those Roman bribes, and they disliked his general aura of mild confusion. After a messy, political situation, which is standard practice at this point, Ptolemy XII fled Egypt. His eldest daughter, Bernice IV, seized power. This was not supposed to happen. But when your father abandons his kingdom to go beg for help in Rome, you sometimes feel entitled to take his office chair. Eventually, the Romans agreed to restore Ptolemy XII to the throne. He returned with Roman soldiers, executed Bernice, and reinstated himself as king. He also married his younger children to one another, as one does, to stabilize the dynasty. Because nothing says stability like forcing your teenage daughter to marry her teenage brother, who may or may not be plotting your downfall. When Ptolemy XII died, he left the throne jointly to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. She was about 18. He was about 10. You can imagine who was better suited to rule. Cleopatra tried to take the reins herself. She appeared on coins without her brother. She signed decrees alone. She may even have quietly pushed her brother and his advisors to the side. Naturally, those advisors were not thrilled. They whispered to the young king about how terribly unfair it was that his older sister got all the attention. So a power struggle began. Around this time, Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt. She hid in the eastern deserts, raising an army. Meanwhile, her brother's advisors celebrated with all the maturity of middle school bullies, who suddenly own a government. Now we drift gently over to the next piece of this royal fiasco. Enter Julius Caesar. He arrived in Alexandria, fresh from his own civil war, hoping to collect debts owed to Rome. Imagine Caesar, exhausted, stepping off his ship only to discover that the Egyptian royal siblings had turned the palace into a live-action soap. Opera got Cleopatra knew she needed Caesar's support. She famously had herself smuggled into the palace, supposedly rolled inside a carpet. Whether it was a carpet or a bedding sack, or just an overdramatic story later added by historians, we don't truly know. But it's the sort of detail we cherish, because it adds just the right sprinkle of theatrical nonsense. Caesar, about 52, was charmed. Cleopatra, 21, was brilliant, charismatic, and politically convenient. She understood that Rome held control over her destiny, and Caesar appreciated that she understood. Their alliance and romantic relationship gave Cleopatra the upper hand. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors panicked, which was their primary hobby. They launched a civil war against Cleopatra and Caesar. Picture Alexandria filled with Roman legions, Egyptian soldiers, political tension, and scholars in the library whispering, "Please don't burn anything important." Naturally, something important got burned anyway. We don't talk about it too loudly around librarians. Eventually, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while trying to flee. It was not a glamorous end. Drowning rarely is. With her brother defeated, Cleopatra was reinstated as queen. But the tradition demanded she share the throne. So she married another brother, Ptolemy XIV, just to maintain the family aesthetic of mild genetic panic. Let's pause here and gently drift into Cleopatra's personal life. Cleopatra gave birth to Caesar's child, a son named Caesarion, Little Caesar, not the pizza chain, though that would have been economically wise. Caesar returned to Rome, leaving Cleopatra in control of Egypt. She maintained a delicate balance of independence and Roman influence. She visited Rome several times, staying in a luxurious villa where she dazzled senators, irritated conservative matrons, and triggered gossip that echoed through marble hallways. Romans didn't love the idea of their beloved Caesar being enthralled by a foreign queen, especially one not afraid to enter a room with confidence. Confidence was alarming then. Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, just like that. Cleopatra's greatest supporter was gone. She returned to Egypt, allegedly poisoning her other brother, Ptolemy XIV, so her son Caesarion could be caught. When in doubt, eliminate a sibling. It's practically a family motto. Let's drift forward again into the smooth currents of politics. Rome plunged into chaos. Various factions clawed for power. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's allies, eventually summoned Cleopatra for explanations related to grain shipments, money, and loyalty. Cleopatra sailed to meet him. On a grand barge, purple sails, perfume wafting through the air. She understood optics. If you're going to impress a Roman general, you float in with style. Antony, never known for resisting spectacle, was captivated. He had the strategic brilliance of a seasoned commander, paired with the emotional self-control of a dramatic poet. Perfect for Cleopatra's political needs. They formed an alliance and a romantic one again. They spent winters together, thrown into feasts, games, and extravagant displays that made Roman traditionalists clutch their gas. Cleopatra bore him children. Twins, in fact. As if she were collecting famous Romans for a dynastic museum. However, back in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, watched anxiously. He disliked Antony's entanglement with Cleopatra. He disliked Cleopatra's influence, and he disliked the growing rumor that Antony planned to move the capital to Alexandria, which, politically speaking, would be like suggesting, "You'll move your ex's furniture back into the house." Tension rose until war was declared not technically on Antony, but on Cleopatra. Romans preferred to frame the conflict as defending themselves from a foreign queen, and her suspiciously seductive eyeliner. The decisive naval battle happened at Actium in 31 BCE. Cleopatra and Antony's fleet struggled. Cleopatra fled the battle first, followed by Antony, who chased her ship because chasing Cleopatra was becoming something of a professional specialty. They returned to Egypt. Octavian's forces followed. As defeat loomed, Antony fell into despair. Rumors reached him that Cleopatra had died, an unfortunately believable idea, considering how many people in his life had already died dramatically. Grief-stricken, he attempted to take his own life. He botched the attempt, naturally, and was carried bleeding to Cleopatra's hiding place. He died in her presence, which was poetically tragic, but also logistically inconvenient. Cleopatra soon faced Octavian. He planned to parade her through Rome as a trophy queen. Cleopatra, who had always maintained control over her image, refused this final humiliation, and so she ended her life. The famous snake story and asper bite, traditional, though historians question it. It might have been poison applied more discreetly. Either way, she chose her exit, asterisk.